Wilfred Owen was a soldier who fought for England during the First World War in the trenches. He was celebrated for his bravery and his courage. At one point, he was hospitalized for shell shock, what we, of course, would call PTSD. And he had the opportunity to stay in the hospital indefinitely, but he eventually chose to go back to the front lines and to continue fighting, and he ended up being killed in combat just a week before the signing of the armistice, a week before the end of World War I. Wilfred Owen was also a poet, and he is widely considered to be one of the greatest poets of World War I. One of the things that's really interesting to me when I read Owen's poetry is that for the most part, he doesn't try to describe or treat the experiences, the horrors, the carnage of what he saw head on. He doesn't paint, he doesn't take us, for the most part, to the trench warfare. And instead, he uses his poetry to talk about these things and to talk about these horrors in a very oblique way, in a roundabout way, as if he's carrying this burden that he can't fully look at. There's something too intense about it, and instead he likes to use reflections. He looks at things in the way that they're refracted on other people or across time. One example of this, a poem that I really love, where you have Wilfred Owen keeping the horrors off stage, is a poem called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young. And in this poem, Owens retells the Bible story of the binding of Isaac. So in this poem, Abraham is taking Isaac up the mountain. And just like we get in the Bible, Isaac asks his father, "Where is the ram for the sacrifice?" At the end of Owen's retelling of the story, the dramatic reveal where God says, "Don't slay the child." So, quote, "An angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one." And so, if ever there was a pointing of the finger at the older generation, the brutality and the insensitivity of the older generation that doesn't understand what Owen and his generation is going through. Another example of the way Owen uses what I think of as like mirrors that reflect the trauma and the enormity of the horror that he is struggling to describe is a poem called Mental Cases. And in this poem, he's looking at people who are shell-shocked, people who are traumatized from their war experience, and he's describing these people. Quote, "Who are these? Why sit they here in twilight? Wherefore rock they, purgatorial shadows, drooping tongues from jaws that slob their relish?" Now I'm skipping a bit. "These are men whose minds the dead have ravished, memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed, waiting slows of flesh, these helpless wander, treading blood from lungs that had loved laughter. Always they must see these things and hear them, batter of guns and shatter of flying muscles, carnage incomparable and human squander, rucked too thick for these men's extrication." And the poem goes on, but stop there. And in this poem, you get powerful poetic language of that carnage, of that slop of flesh that these men experience, but the poem describes the after image, the way in which those experiences are now imprinted on the minds of these people who are in a state of derangement, basically. One of the images that Owen loved to use and loved to come back to is this image of the smiling corpse, or the smiling skull. And he evokes this image in a lot of different poems, and for Owen, it represents, I think, the insanity, the smiling, grotesque insanity of war. And in addition, in certain poems, it also captures this paradox where, of course, death is the most horrible thing, but in Owen's world, it's also the ultimate relief and the ultimate release. It's the moment when you can finally smile and be at peace. One striking example of this image is in a poem titled SIW, which stands for Self-Inflicted Wound. And it's a poem in 4 parts, and it just tells the story of the soldier who's out on watch. And the next day they find him and he has a bullet in his head, and they discover that it was suicide. And again, this being one of the themes that Owen is constantly exploring, the way in which war unravels people and unravels the mind. And he ends the poem, "With him they buried the muzzle his teeth had kissed, and truthfully wrote the mother, Tim died smiling." In his poem Apologia pro Pomate Mio, Owens takes this theme of smiling and the hilarity of the carnage to sort of like a much higher level, a more of an extreme place. Quote, "I too saw God through mud, the mud that cracked on cheeks when wretches smiled. War brought more glory to their eyes than blood, and gave their laughs more glee than shakes a child. Merry it was to laugh there, where death becomes absurd and life absurder. For power was on us as we slashed bones bare, not to feel sickness or remorse of murder." And it's a longer poem, it goes on, but stop there. Additionally, Owens often wrote about veterans who come home from war. He wrote about people who are trying to adjust in society, maimed both in body and in spirit. And there are rare few poems where he seems to really shine the light, put the camera on the combat, the trench warfare that he was familiar with as a soldier. One example which is close to that is a poem called Exposure. But I think the most striking example and the most powerful example of these sort of rare instances where we get the most clear image we get from Owen of the horrors he experienced firsthand is a poem called Sentry. The Sentry. Quote, "We'd found an old Boche dugout, and he knew and gave us hell. For shell on frantic shell, hammered on top, but never quite burst through. Rain guttering down in waterfalls of slime, kept slush waist high and rising hour by hour, and choked the steps too thick with clay to climb. What murk of air remained stank old and sour, with fumes of whiz-bangs and the smell of men who'd lived their years and left their curse in the den, if not their corpses. There we herded from the blast of whiz-bangs, but one found our door at last, buffeting eyes and breath, snuffing the candles, and thud, flump, thud, down the steep steps came thumping and sploshing in the flood, deluging muck, the sentry's body, then his rifle, handles of old Bosch bombs, and mud in ruck on ruck. We dragged him up for killed, until he whined, "Oh, sir, my eyes, I'm blind, I'm blind, I'm blind." Coaxing, I held a flame against his lids, and said if he could see the least blurred light, he was not blind. In time, he'd get all right. "I can't," he sobbed. Eyeballs huge, bulged like squids. Watch my dreams still. But I forgot him there, in posting next for duty, and sending a scout to beg a stretcher somewhere, and floundering about to other posts under the shrieking air. Those other wretches, how they bled and spewed, and one who would have drowned himself for good. I try not to remember these things now. Let dread hark back for one word only. How, half listening to that sentry's moans and jumps, and the wild chattering of his broken teeth, renewed most horribly whenever crumps pummeled the roof and slogged the air beneath. Through the dense din, I say, we heard him shout, "I see your lights," but ours had long gone out. And that final scene at the end, where the injured soldier who's chattering under the barrage of bombs with broken teeth, he calls out, "I see your light. I see the light." And the poet says, ours had long gone out. And so on a narrative level, the soldier is having some sort of hallucination, and he's suddenly optimistic. He says, my eyesight is coming back. He sees some light. And the poet is saying, but it's pitch black. The poet understands that the sentry is mistaken. But of course, the finality of those words, ours had long gone out, evokes more than just the darkness of the bunker, but a total sense of being completely extinguished and just bled dry, which I think is at the core, the spiritual core of so much of what Owen is writing about.